gotta come back with me.
Where? Back to my decade, Marty, that's where. Arnie and Sly, Back to the Future, Indiana Jones, Iron Maiden, Metallica, The Labyrinth movie, Jennifer Connelly's eyes, Jennifer Connelly's nose, Jennifer... Right. Halloween, the first Terminator movie, and the last Star Wars movie. But Alex, that was not the last Star Wars movie.
Zip it, Gigi, hot did that.
I have nothing more to say to you.
This was also the decade of side-scrolling platformers and its most iconic timeless names like Castlevania, Ninja Gaiden, Metroid, Megaman, Contra, and of course, the king of overrated video game franchises.
It's me, Mario!
The bullshetto, Mario. Cut the bullshetto. These names still come out of your tender lips and tongues, even if
You're all not worthy.
even if you had not been born when they all began. But more importantly, this was the decade of my favoritist video game company of all time, and my first favorite video game genre. So hop into your DeLoreans and buckle up.
Where we're going, we don't need roads.
Fine, then don't buckle up. You do you. But we're still going back. Back to the 80s. This time around, we are going to need a couple of rules. First, no stacking. Franchises were out of control in the 80s, so we are very much going to need this one. Second, my release date, my platform. Back in the days, release dates were wild and loose. Some games came years apart for some regions, so if a game came out during the 80s in my region and for my platform of choice, it's fair game. Third, this is a personal list. This rule is especially important in this decade because I don't like platformers.
Fuck me, right?
If you disagree with my list,
You know, that's just like, your opinion, man.
but I would still like to read all about it in the comment section down below. And while you're at it, it won't kill you to click that subscribe button. Just pretend it's a start game button, right? This time around I had a hard time leaving games out, so I am going to resort to the oldest, cheapest trick in the book.
Honorable mentions.
But wait, what goes in honorable mentions? Well, games that are excellent, but not quite my thing. Or maybe some that are really good, but have not aged gracefully. So here are a few honorable mentions. Mountain King, 1983. The forefather of what is nowadays known as Metroidvanias. Erroneously, if you ask me. Mountain King is a game for the Atari 2600, so it predates both Metroid and Castlevania, but it was years ahead of its time. In a side-scrolling scenario, you had to find the invisible flame, which you then had to use to summon a skull that you had to climb in order to get the crown and then cheese the hell out of there. Side-scrolling platformers that had quests? That just wasn't a thing in the early 80s, and that alone earns Mountain King an honorable mention. Golden Axe, 1989. Alright, this is cheating a bit, I know. You can't quite compare arcade games to home consoles and PC games in the 80s. But we are technically in the right decade. Golden Axe was a medieval fantasy brawler, much like Final Fight or Streets of Rage, but with swords, goblins, and magic. This was ludicrously ahead of its time. You had 3 different characters to choose from, all with significantly different looks, combat moves, and magic attacks. It had mini-games, mounts, and the most impressive graphics for its time. It hasn't aged well though. That's not how I remember this hit collision detection. Near the end it became a coin sink because, of course it did. Contra, 1988. The infamous tough-as-nails, side-scrolling, alien-slaughtering extravaganza that stood the test of time. Although that won't go on for too long if the last Contra game is anything to go by. But my friends were oh-boying and oh-wowing about this one in the 80s, and rightfully so. Although I think this franchise reached its peak with Contra 3 Alien Wars in the 90s, and although this isn't quite my cup of tea, there's no denying that it was one of the best games of the decade. And playing it with a friend was something else completely. A different kind of pain, that is. Double Dragon 2, The Revenge, 1988. Double Dragon is the forefather of brawling, and if you ask me, Final Fight and Streets of Rage were never quite what Double Dragon 2 was. I'm not a fan of platforming, we've already established that, but what little platforming there was in Double Dragon 2 made a huge difference. It was something that felt kind of absent in these other newer brawling games. I had precious few opportunities to play this along with a friend, but I also greatly enjoyed playing this one solo. Plus, it even had its little secrets here and there. Tetris, 1984. Talk about timeless, immortal classics. The endless amount of versions that this game has had over more than 40 years should tell you all you need to know about how good it was. Though it was never my favorite, like everyone else who played it, I'm also guilty of sinking dozens of hours into this one. I think some people exaggerate when they say it's one of the best games of all time, but it is probably the game that has aged the best of all time. And yes, it also has the most infectious soundtrack of all time, which we are not going to play here in the interest of not imprinting it on your brain for weeks again. So these are my 10 favorite games from the 80s. Ninja Gaiden, 1989. The original Ninja Gaiden was released in 1989 in America. Excruciatingly difficult games that put your thumb-eye coordination and speed to the test have never been my thing, but holy shit, this game was awesome. It was fast-paced, tense and intense, and also Ryo Hayabusa was hands down the best ninja there was at the time, and the stakes of it all felt larger than life. In addition to that, along with Castlevania 3, it had the coolest and most context-useful special skills. For those of you who came to know story-based action games in the 2000s,
you know nothing, Jon Snow.
This was the OG, guys. Also, there are only 3 words to describe the music, and especially the graphics in Ninja Gaiden.
Amazing.
Unlike Contra and Castlevania, which have had their ups and downs, Ninja Gaiden has been pure gold in all its renditions. And for that, I salute you. Wizardry, Proving Grounds of the Mad Overlord, 1987. RPGs might have not been a big thing in the 80s compared to side-scrolling platformers, but Wizardry, even if it was originally released in 1980 for home computers, just had to make the list. The Nintendo cartridge was thicker than any other game I had in my collection, and my simplistic reasoning was, maybe it's because it stores your progress. Almost 40 years later, I'm still convinced of this. An endless brownish labyrinth was all there was to Wizardry, and my family always wondered why I spent hours yelling at a game that was all text, black screens, and a brownish labyrinth. Also, my closest friend just didn't understand why I liked this game so much. Oh, the life of the misunderstood RPG fan. Wizardry's manual was the first awesome game manual I ever read, which was also convenient because, unlike most other NES games, Wizardry was a game that you absolutely could not get into without reading the manual, at all. If you think Baldur's Gate is where it all started for computer RPGs,
you know nothing, Jon Snow.
It was here, for both Western RPGs and JRPGs. I loved that you created an entire party, even if at the time I knew shit about classes and balance, despite the manual making all of it abundantly clear. This was a game in which permanent death was very much a thing, and you could lose your entire party. And you couldn't save whenever you wished, but if your party was about to wipe, at least for the NES, you could reset cheese it, and hope that the game had not gone on for too long without auto-saving. As you might have figured, this one took me ages to finish, but Wizardry taught me a valuable lesson for life. When it comes to RPGs, you can like thieves or dislike them, but you can't do without them. Super Mario Bros. 3, 1988. Okay, so this game was good. Actually, it was great. The game design in Mario 3 was way better than any of its peers, if that's what you want to hear. It also had a map that you could navigate however you wished, filled with random events and secrets. There was flying, swimming, and oddly enough, resource management. This last thing was pretty fucking ahead of its time even. There were also little secrets for those who wanted to skip half the game. For those with an affinity for fast travel. This was Nintendo at its best, and this entry blew everything else out of the water around its time. Super Mario 3 may very well be the best platformer of its time. I hope you enjoyed this, because there is a good chance you won't ever hear me talk about this franchise in this channel again. Castlevania 3, Dracula's Curse, 1989. Yep, definitely not as pretty, varied, or even remotely well designed as Super Mario Bros. 3. But this was a European medieval fantasy, and that alone, if done with minimum standards of decency, places it above any Mario game in my estimation. Also, the replay value came from following different paths and choosing different companions. I also loved that you had 4 different endings depending on which companion you brought along with you. Yes, Trevor's movements were stiff, and you couldn't quite control his jumps like you could in Ninja Gaiden or Mario. But why you could control some characters' jumps and not others, that's beyond me. Also, graphics weren't stellar, but the feeling of adventure, boss encounters, and the overall medieval feeling was enough for me to forgive anything. Oh yes, and it had perhaps the most iconic soundtrack in the history of video games. Fine, one of the most iconic soundtracks. Fuck you, Mario. Actually, there was a half-assed 4th entry in the franchise for the Super Nintendo that everybody loved. For petty reasons. You could crack your whip in 8 different directions, and you could latch onto things a la Tarzan, and it had 16-bit music. Fuck you, Konami. You took away my companions, Konami. You took away my choice of paths, and instead gave me this tease of a map that you can't even navigate. You took away my multiple endings and instead regaled me with this pixelated view of Simon Belmont's obese legs. Well, fuck you, Super Castlevania 4. Thank the maker this was only a bump in the road for the franchise, as not much later, in the 90s, we got the quintessential Castlevania game, but we'll leave that one for another video. Lakers vs. Celtics, 1989. Before sports games became
Hot garbage!
there were a couple of insanely good ones, and Lakers vs. Celtics was one such game. And although the experience is not at all comparable to NBA 2K16, this game is still worth playing from time to time. I don't think there is a single year in which I don't sink an hour or two in this one. You can tell that this game is great because its mechanics are still something you can get into, even 35 years later. And that's more than can be said of many newer games, even some really good ones. Police Quest 2: The Vengeance, 1988. The original Police Quest was an adventure game based on a true story. It was also borderline a police simulation game. You had to do lots of annoying things, like checking your tires before you went out on patrol, or following a certain protocol to have someone arrested. And it also lacked even the most basic structure for a story. Guys, when you're telling a true story, it must still be a story. You must still have a plot, and acts, and plot points, and rising action, and characters have to undergo a journey. Thankfully, most of this got fixed with the second game, and holy fuck how. This time around there was not only a story, it was a freaking non-stop police thriller with murder, chases, plot twists, and the kidnapping of your girlfriend, who by the way was the girl who helped you in the first game with your case in exchange for the dismissal of prostitution charges against her. I missed the time when games had balls. This was nothing short of an interactive episode of CSI mixed together with some sweet tropey cheese, trademark of action flicks from the 80s. And if this game is not higher on the list, it's because, man, it took these guys 4 games to finally produce a decent climactic ending. The first 2 entries in this series ended in an abrupt and unceremonious way, so it's only fitting that I end their entry equally abruptly. Yeah, that'll teach them. Quest for Glory. So you want to be a hero? 1989. You want to be a hero. We arrived to our final destination, Station Sierra. For me, Sierra was quite simply the absolute king of video games. Nowadays, there's talk of publishers and developers, Ubisoft this, EA that, Naughty Dog this, Blizzard that. Back in the day, there was only one top-tier video game company for me, and that was Sierra. Everyone else was a pale imitation. But Alex, what about LucasArts and Tecmo and Konami and...
Zip it, Gigi Hadid.
I have nothing more to say to you.
Quest for Glory was probably minute for minute better than some other games that are coming up next. It certainly was more ambitious in its blend of mechanics and themes. This game was originally titled Hero's Quest, but Sierra eventually changed its name to Quest for Glory because of some trademark shenanigans. Regardless of what you want to call it, this game was pretty freaking unique. It was a text parsing adventure game with RPG mechanics. The story was also pretty surprisingly immersive, and like most other Sierra games, it didn't shy away from humor. To be honest, I don't think I've played anything quite like this. I do appreciate those who try to bring back that sweet blend of adventure and RPGing. If this game is not higher on the list, it's because I got caught in the first girlfriend syndrome with some other series like King's Quest, Police Quest, and Leisure Suit Larry. And when this one came out, my heart already belonged to someone else. Quest for Glory did steal dozens of hours of gameplay though. This was also my first cosplay. It was also my last. Space Quest 3: The Pirates of Pestulon, 1989. I'm all about humor and levity, and you might have noticed that I have a weak spot for puns, and I'm also fairly big on sci-fi. The Space Quest series took all of that, blended it together, and distilled it into a flavor of its own. Space Quest 3 was challenging, freaking hilarious, and in spite of often dipping into farce, like this moment here in which you see this supervisor going full Castlevania on his employee, it managed to sell itself as a perilous adventure with high stakes, one that you wanted to get to the end of to save the day. This might well be the most underrated Sierra series, and Space Quest 3 is its best entry in the 80s. Leisure Suit Larry 3: Passionate Patty in Pursuit of the Pulsating Pectorals, 1989. I could have chosen the first game in this series, as it is probably the quintessential text-parsing adventure game. An adventure game about some middle-aged loser trying to get lucky with the ladies was nothing like anyone had seen up until then. And yet it was fun, challenging, and a tour de force of humor that went from dumb puns to clever humor to the exploitation of stereotypes that no one found offensive. Yup, Those were the days. But the third game in the series was just a freaking quantum leap for the saga. It was a powerhouse of humor and adventure that even introduced fresh, exciting concepts. You never expected to play 1/3 of the game as Patty, looking for Larry after he misinterpreted something you said and left, and yet, there you were. You never expected anything different to come out of you leaving the casino dressed as an exotic female dancer and walking into your attorney's office dressed like that. You thought it was an oversight. Oh, but something different did indeed happen when you went into the attorney's office dressed like a girl, only to find out that your lawyer was into
Alternative adult recreational practices.
This little alternative episode had a ton of dialogue, a truckload of points for you to collect, and it rewarded your little cross-dressing experiment with what was arguably the most hilarious scene in the game. Alternative paths such as this one were not commonplace in text parsing games back in the day, as they were mostly linear. You also never expected an action minigame in a text parsing game, did you? Well, that one we could have done without. Yes, Leisure Suit Larry 3 was deceitfully ahead of its time, and it was a strong contender for that top spot, but you know me. In my book, medieval fantasy beats everything else. So, King's Quest IV, The Perils of Rosella. Ella. 1988. Told you the King's Quest franchise stole my heart as a kid? By the time I got my hands on the 4th entry, I had played 3 of these little King's Quest text parsing fuckers. I wandered aimlessly in King's Quest games more than in any of the other games from any of the other series by Sierra. But there was just something about the Graham family and helping them succeed. The immersion in this franchise was second to none, and this one was, by far, the most solid entry up until that point. One thing that made this title better than its predecessor was that if you had at least very basic knowledge of fantasy and folk tales, the game wasn't all that hard to figure out. I was also under the impression that the text parser AI understood a lot more than in previous games. Also, the feeling of adventure that I got from King's Quest IV took me back to the time of Zork and Colossal Cave Adventure like no other game had until that moment. I can't say it might have even raised the bar a little. The main character stranded on a faraway land has been a bit of a staple of the series. Looking at it from this perspective, King's Quest IV and King's Quest VI have almost the exact same premise. But it doesn't really bother me, especially when you compare the event that triggers the adventure in King's Quest IV to the ham-fisted and cheese-fisted excuses we got in most of the other games of its time. During 15th century Europe, there lived a person named Dracula. He practiced sorcery in order to create a bad world filled with evil. This time King Graham is about to pass the torch of adventuring on to his children. The torch is quite literally his trademark hat, and as it flies across the room in the direction of his expectant children, Graham suddenly falls ill. Oh no, how could this be? Rosella then laments the situation alone in the throne room, and while she wonders out loud if there is anything she could do to save her father, some magical fairy speaks to her through Merlin's mirror in the throne room. Apparently, the magical internet service on which Merlin's mirror runs is every bit as bad in Daventry as it is in my country. So the fairy basically, and conveniently, only has time to tell Rosella that she can help her save her father's life in return for a favor that requires Rosella to go with her. She can't explain anymore because the flimsy magical internet connection is about to go off. Completely. Well, that's convenient. And there's also no guarantee that Rosella will be able to come back from the fairy's isolated faraway magical world. It's an all-or-nothing deal. In the nick of time, right before the mirror's crappy magical internet connection goes offline, Rosella decides to risk everything and go with the fairy. Well, I have questions, like, how did the fairy know how and when to contact Rosella? Does she magically monitor every royal family there is like a secret service agency so that she could conveniently show up to offer them magical boons in exchange for royal help? Merlin's mirror had been in the family for ages by this point. It's one of the Graham's most treasured possessions. It's like a medieval version of the Zoom app that helps the Graham family communicate with everyone everywhere. Yet, Rosella seems surprised when someone reaches her through it. Didn't she know about the mirror? And if so, why didn't she? Did she conveniently doze off every time the mirror was used or talked about? But these are questions one would ask in the year 2021. Questions that nobody asked 33 years ago, when we were all naive enough to be happy with this premise. Or this premise. And also, these fantastical, albeit all too convenient events, ultimately placed the protagonist of the story in the most adventurous starting point one could hope for. Think of the best dungeons in Pathfinder Kingmaker. Think of the expansion Trials of the Lure Master for Heart of Winter. They are interesting and thrilling because you can't go back the way you came. You have to brave whatever is ahead of you in the hopes of finding your way out. And this is where Rosella finds herself. Her father is ill, maybe even already dead, and she's stranded in a place she knows nothing about. One thing about this 4th entry is that some of its challenges come in the form of allegories to well-known folk tales. There's this part of the game in which you walk by a pond in which there's a frog wearing a crown. I wonder what I'll have to do with it. I wonder if opening this Pandora's box will bring anything bad. Also, these graphics may not do anything for you now, but back in 1988, they were capable of taking me on a journey of immersion and were even capable of scaring the living shit out of me at times. Unlike most other Sierra games of its time, King's Quest IV wasn't particularly humorous. It was not a non-stop maelstrom of jokes, puns, and funny references like the Larry games or the Space Quest series, but it also wasn't above cracking a joke or two, often at your expense, to add some much-needed levity every now and then. Though it may not be so for those who prefer platformers, brawlers, racing games, or the brilliant simplicity of games like Tetris, Sierra was the king of the 80s for me, and King's Quest IV, The Perils of Rosella, the king of that Sierra. So, the 70s was the decade of music, the 80s was the decade of movies. Might the next decade be that of video games? I guess you'll have to wait for the next entry on this series, for believe me,
I'll be back.
And I have nothing more to say to you.
If you liked the video, give it a thumbs up. If you didn't, thank you for watching all the way up until now. If you like what you're seeing in this channel, please consider subscribing and clicking that notification bell to avoid the usual YouTube shenanigans. Share the video, but most importantly, never stop gaming, but don't let gaming get in the way of your hopes and dreams. Bye everyone.